What happens to a country when the one thing keeping its government alive suddenly stops working? Right now, that question isn't hypothetical anymore. It's sitting on a tiny island in the Persian Gulf, and the world is watching to see if someone finally pulls the trigger. Before we go any further, if you care about what's really happening in this war and not just the headlines, hit subscribe right now, tap like on this video, and send it to one person who still thinks this conflict is only about missiles and borders. Because it isn't. It's about money. And the story of that money runs through one small piece of land you've probably never heard of until this year. That piece of land is called Kharg Island. It's barely a speck on a map, sitting about 20 to 30 kilometers off Iran's southwestern coast in the northern Persian Gulf. You could drive across most of it in 20 minutes. And yet this tiny island is responsible for shipping out roughly 90% of every barrel of oil Iran sells to the rest of the world. Let that sink in for a second. 90%, not from a handful of ports spread across the country from one island. The reason it carries that much weight comes down to engineering. Kharg has deep water jetties built directly into the coastline, which means the biggest oil tankers on the planet, the ones called VLCCs, capable of hauling 2 million barrels in a single trip, can pull right up and load without needing smaller ships to ferry oil out to them first. That kind of setup took decades to build. You can't recreate it somewhere else in a few months, no matter how much money you throw at the problem. Underneath the island, pipelines connect back to Iran's largest oil fields on the mainland. Above ground, storage tanks the size of small stadiums hold crude oil waiting to be loaded. Thousands of workers keep the whole operation running day and night. In plain terms, Kharg Island is the financial heart of the Iranian government. Cut it off, and you're not causing an inconvenience. You're stopping the blood flow. Now here's what makes the last several months so strange when you really think about it. This war between the United States, Israel, and Iran has been going on since February, and it has been brutal. Strikes on missile sites, strikes on air defenses, strikes on command centers, entire military installations flattened in a single night. But through almost all of it, one target sat there completely untouched: the oil terminal itself. Not because anyone forgot about it, not because it was hard to hit. Satellite images of Kharg have been public and studied by analysts for years. Everyone knew exactly where every tank, every jetty, every pipeline sat. It was left alone on purpose. In mid-March, American forces launched a massive strike on Kharg Island, hitting more than 90 separate military targets in a single night. Air defense systems, a naval base, missile storage facilities, all of it destroyed. Iranian state media reported explosions ringing out across the island for hours. But when the dust settled, officials on both sides confirmed the same thing. The oil infrastructure was never touched. The storage tanks stayed standing. The loading jetties stayed intact. Oil kept moving. President Trump said publicly that American forces had, in his words, obliterated every military target on the island, while making it very clear the oil facilities were a separate category, one that was being spared on purpose for now. Think about that from a pure military standpoint for a second, because it's actually unusual. In almost any other war in modern history, an enemy's most important economic asset sitting this close to the fighting would be one of the first things destroyed, not the last. Energy infrastructure has been considered a legitimate wartime target since air power first existed. Cutting off an enemy's ability to fund its own war effort is one of the oldest strategies in military history. So the fact that Kharg's oil facilities were specifically, repeatedly, and publicly spared tells you something important. This was never really a military decision. It was political. Kharg wasn't just a target, it was leverage. A card that only had value as long as it stayed on the table. That pattern continued for months. In April, there was a follow-up strike, again focused entirely on military targets, again avoiding the oil terminal. In June, Trump posted publicly that the United States intended to hit Iran extremely hard, and for the first time floated the idea of actually taking over Kharg Island's energy infrastructure completely. That threat got walked back within days, as diplomatic channels scrambled for some kind of pause. Then in early July, as a fragile ceasefire framework started falling apart under renewed attacks on tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, Trump escalated again, warning that any further interference with shipping would put Iran's civilian infrastructure squarely back on the table. And in the final week of July, he brought the focus back to Kharg one more time, posting imagery referencing a possible strike and reigniting the exact same conversation that had been simmering for months. Notice the pattern. Provocation from Iran, usually tied to attacks near the Strait of Hormuz. American threat, specifically naming Kharg as the next possible target. A pause, then another provocation. It's been an escalation ladder with very public, very clearly marked rungs, and as of right now, the actual oil terminal still hasn't been struck. But every single rung on that ladder brings the next one closer, and that's really the story here. Not a confirmed strike, but a countdown that keeps getting shorter, sitting one order away from becoming reality. If you're starting to understand why traders, analysts, and governments all over the world are watching this one island more closely than almost anything else in this entire war, do me a favor and drop a comment right now telling me what you think happens first, a negotiated deal or a strike on the terminal. I read every single one, and I want to know what you think before we go further into what a strike like this would actually mean. Let's talk about what happens if that terminal actually goes down in a serious way, because the math here isn't complicated, it's just brutal. Iran has kept exporting oil throughout this entire war, at times moving over 1 million barrels a day, even in the middle of active strikes, almost entirely because Kharg's oil infrastructure kept functioning no matter what was happening around it. Analysts who track this closely have said plainly that if that infrastructure goes down in any serious, sustained way, you don't just disrupt Iranian exports. You remove close to 2 million barrels a day from the entire global oil market, not rerouted somewhere else. Just gone. Because there is no facility anywhere close to capable of absorbing that volume on short notice. Iran does have backup export points, smaller facilities on islands like Lavon and Syri, left over from decades ago when Kharg itself was repeatedly targeted during the Iran-Iraq War. But those were never built to handle anywhere near Kharg's volume, and trying to shift operations to them in the middle of an active war, with tankers already terrified to enter the region at all, is nothing like doing it in peacetime. Here's where the pressure becomes almost impossible for Iran's government to escape. The overwhelming majority of Iran's oil goes to one buyer above everyone else, China, which has kept buying Iranian crude throughout years of sanctions, specifically because Iran sells it at a steep discount just to keep some revenue coming in. That entire relationship runs almost completely through Kharg's loading jetties. Damage that, even partially, and you're not just hurting a number in a budget spreadsheet somewhere in Tehran. You're attacking the exact mechanism that pays for everything from military salaries to the subsidized fuel and bread prices that have kept large parts of the Iranian population from turning economic anger into open uprising. And not all damage is equal here, which matters a lot if this does happen. Storage tanks look dramatic when they catch fire, but they're actually the least strategically important part of the whole complex, because tanks can be rebuilt fairly quickly, and crude can sometimes still be loaded directly if the jetties and pumps underneath still work. The real prize, the thing that would actually change the outcome of this war, is the loading infrastructure itself, the deep water jetties, the pipeline systems, the pumping stations that physically move oil from storage into a tanker's hold. Damage the tanks, and you get a dramatic headline and a short-term supply scare. Damage the jetties and the pumps in a serious way, and you've created a problem that could take many months, maybe longer, to repair, because that kind of specialized equipment isn't something you can just truck in and bolt back together, especially for a country buried under this many layers of sanctions. Think of it like a business that gets 90% of its revenue from a single client. It doesn't matter how good your other smaller clients are. If something happens to that one relationship, the whole business is suddenly in existential trouble. That's the exact position Iran's economy has been sitting in this entire war. Everyone from oil traders in Singapore to sanctions analysts in Washington has known it, and that's precisely why it's taken this long for anyone to actually pull the trigger on it directly. There's also a side of this that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with fear. Kharg Island sits right at the edge of some of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth, close to the Strait of Hormuz corridor that roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil passes through. Any serious damage, or even just the credible threat of damage at the terminal, sends shockwaves through maritime insurance markets almost instantly. Shipping companies start holding vessels further out or rerouting entirely, even in areas that weren't touched at all. That kind of caution alone can knock a terminal functionally offline, even if most of its equipment still technically works, just because nobody wants to risk a multi-million-dollar tanker anywhere near it. Fear moves markets just as fast as fire does. Now let's step back and look at what this means for the people actually running Iran, because that part of the story explains why this specific target has been treated so differently from everything else in this war. Every government fighting a long, painful conflict eventually has to answer an uncomfortable question inside its own walls. At what point does continuing the fight cost more than what you're fighting to protect? For months, Iran's leadership has been able to tell its own hardliners, its own military commanders, its own religious establishment that the fight is sustainable because the money is still coming in, because Kharg is still loading tankers, because no matter what's happening everywhere else in the country, the core financial engine is still intact. That argument, whether it was ever fully true or not, has given hardliners enough cover to keep pushing for continued resistance instead of a negotiated settlement. But the moment that argument disappears, the moment the terminal itself becomes damaged instead of just threatened, that cover disappears with it. It becomes a lot harder to convince your own security forces that enduring the pressure is a winning strategy, when the very thing that was supposed to fund that endurance is sitting there, damaged, in front of everyone. There's a longer-term cost here too, separate from the immediate economic pain. A country that can't reliably deliver oil it's already agreed to sell starts losing leverage even with the partners who've stuck by it the whole way through. China has kept buying Iranian oil because it's cheap, steady, and low-risk politically compared to other options. A terminal that can't consistently load tankers on schedule turns Iranian oil from a reliable bargain into a risky gamble, and countries buying oil at scale don't usually stay loyal to unreliable suppliers for very long once other options exist. That's not a headline the way a burning terminal is, but over time it might matter just as much, because it threatens the one real revenue relationship Iran has left that isn't just political solidarity, Before we go further, if this is helping you actually understand why this one island might matter more than almost anything else happening in this war right now, hit that subscribe button, and if you're watching this on your phone, take 3 seconds and share it to your story. Not for me, but because most people following this war have no idea Kharg even exists, and once they understand it, the rest of the headlines start making a lot more sense. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger strategic picture, because this conflict has always had a small handful of lines everyone understood were different from the rest. Crossing them wouldn't just escalate the war, it would change what kind of war this actually is. Tehran itself, the question of Iran's nuclear stockpile, and Kharg Island have consistently been treated as the 3 biggest of those lines. Strikes on infrastructure near Tehran have already happened. The nuclear stockpile situation remains a live, ongoing standoff with no clean resolution in sight. And Kharg, arguably the most economically important of the 3, is the one still sitting there, threatened again and again, but not yet crossed. Here's what that pattern tells you about where this war is heading. Every one of these supposed red lines has, over time, turned out to be less of a permanent boundary and more of a pause, a line that holds right up until the provocation on the other side becomes frequent enough or severe enough that crossing it starts to look like the easier option rather than the unthinkable one. If Kharg follows that same pattern, and everything about the last 5 months suggests it might, then the moment it happens, the psychological impact on Iran's leadership could end up mattering even more than the physical damage itself. It would tell them, in the most direct way possible, that nothing is permanently protected anymore, just because destroying it would be economically catastrophic. Up until now, hardliners could tell themselves the oil money would keep flowing no matter how bad things got everywhere else, because nobody had actually been willing to pull that specific trigger. That belief only works as long as the ceiling holds. It stops working the second everyone realizes the ceiling was never guaranteed in the first place. There's also something worth understanding about how wars like this tend to actually end. Wars fought over territory usually end with a negotiated line drawn on a map somewhere. Wars fought through economic pressure end very differently. Either the country under pressure finds some outside lifeline to replace what it's lost, which looks increasingly unlikely for Iran given how isolated its remaining trade relationships already are, or the internal pressure inside the country becomes the actual deciding factor. Protests that security forces can no longer afford to shut down because they can no longer afford to pay the people doing the shutting down. That's the quiet, unglamorous way economic warfare actually wins conflicts. Not through one dramatic night of strikes, but through a slow, compounding realization inside a government that it's running out of road, with everyone below it in the chain of command starting to notice the same thing at roughly the same time. So where does that leave things right now in the first week of August? Kharg's oil terminal is still standing, still loading tankers, still the one card Iran has left that nobody has actually taken off the table yet. But every threat, every near miss, every walked back warning over the last 5 months has pushed this closer to the moment where someone finally decides the value of destroying that card outweighs the value of keeping it as leverage. If that moment comes, it changes everything about how this war can end. Because a ceasefire conversation that used to include Iran keeping its core economic lifeline intact suddenly has to answer a much harder question. Not just how do we stop the fighting, but how does a government with a permanently damaged oil export system even function well enough to hold up its end of any agreement at all? And if it doesn't come, if Kharg somehow stays standing through whatever happens next, that in itself tells you something too. It tells you that even after everything this war has already destroyed, both sides still understand that some lines carry a weight heavier than momentum, heavier than anger, heavier than the desire to finally finish what's been dragging on for 5 brutal months. Watch what happens to oil prices over the coming weeks. Watch whether tanker traffic near the Strait of Hormuz keeps shrinking or starts to recover. And watch whether Kharg Island finally becomes the moment that forces some kind of resolution, either at a negotiating table or through pressure building from inside Iran that its government simply can't contain anymore. Because whichever way this goes, the world already learned something important these past 5 months. Even the lines everyone agrees are too dangerous to cross don't stay untouchable forever. They just stay untouched until the cost of leaving them alone finally gets higher than the cost of crossing them. If this video helped you actually understand why one small island in the Persian Gulf might decide the outcome of this entire war, that's exactly why I make these breakdowns. Hit like if you made it this far, subscribe if you want to stay ahead of this story as it develops, and tell me in the comments what you think happens to Kharg Island next. I'll see you in the next one.